Hello all, and now we're going to look at a couple of Hume's smaller works. Uh, as I said, we were going to talk about religion and ethics, and so the two in particular we're going to look at is his thoughts on natural religion and natural history of religion. And it's kind of more of the psychological basis and accounting, and it's kind of interesting because Hume is really one of the first to offer up a sort of historical accounting on a sort of empirical basis, as he would put it. History wasn't really like that before that, and obviously out of this you're going to have a attempted scientific accounting of history and consciousness and all of that sort of thinking that comes out of that. I think you can trace back to Hume. There's actually a lot, I would say, that you can trace back to Hume to go on that I really think is worth giving him credit for, that people might overlook or maybe didn't see the strain coming as origins from these texts here. But so his natural religion is really a dialogue between three characters of different standpoints of ontology and teleological and logical arguments and their limitations. To really summarize how it's laid out, you have Hume's kind of different boundary setting between logic, the limits of ontology, and what is the evidence of teleological arguments if only our perceptions of what is considered teleological is one of his main points within the dialogue. But I think if there's kind of a footnote really to give to people watching this, and certainly people on the dissident thinking along the right, and just reactionaries or even leftists in general, I suppose, is noticing the difference that Hume is trying to build, and that plagues us currently, on what our beliefs are in contrast to the pragmatic of action within these social institutions. And you can see him trying to work on the difference between what do you actually believe in and the practicality of philosophy. He talks about the difference between logical proofs and practical philosophy. This kind of, I think, has a harmony to it towards, or at least a congruency, if you will, towards thinking within the sphere of what are our beliefs and how do we deal with optics and questions like that arise all the time. You can trace back even here with Hume. He's obviously not the only thinker to have this sort of distinction by any stretch, but it's still kind of interesting to see him tandem with it. But the other ideas I really wanted to touch up on is his ideas of polytheism really coming as a sort of psychological development to account for a monotheistic sort of erosion, if you will, or a lack of faith. I think it's kind of interesting to maybe synthesize this with some power analysis, and that we've looked at on the channel, of course, certainly with Hume. But so I think it's kind of interesting to see how Hume's trying to build a historical account of the crumbling of monotheism, and how polytheism sort of in the psychological development, you have different emotions, different passions that overcome the human spirit or experience, if you will. And so you have different gods or explanations, if you will, out of that. And so I think polytheism is something that he leans towards, and that sort of way. But then I wanted to also talk about the idea of, ordered unity, of course, as I mentioned before. This sort of critique of the telos of, we just have these sort of simplistic ideas that we complexify, but we don't actually understand whether or not this is actually unified, or is this just our perception of unification, is another interesting argument that he brings up when he's looking at the telos. Could also be interesting to point out that his account of monotheism is a sort of rational take of religion, is to sort of make an ordinance of how we cannot explain original impressions. And so going back to, the pre-Socratic idea of the one, that is sort of the rational psychology of wanting to, explain original impressions, to Hume at least. It's also interesting maybe to point out that when you don't have a unified society or a unified vision, what is the vacuum that is created out of that? And it's interesting maybe to perhaps look at how his way of looking at the psychology of polytheism and its forces being represented to many different gods. Do we have gods of different sins today? And I think you see that all the time in this sort of hypermodern experience that perhaps is interesting to look at when you have that sort of lost combined vision that he points out historically. And so evil to him is interesting to look at because it's this sort of lack of order or lack of purpose. The problem of evil is really to do with the gap left between reason and emotion within religion. And so you see that sort of disharmony between reason and emotion. What's the evidential value of these religious experiences if we can only account for them outside of reason, and reason has to circulate through sensation, is what Hume is trying to grapple with in a sort of way here. And so how he really kind of makes the step is how he takes inference, and he mentions it a couple times as going beyond a sort of logical step that the mind has to take for belief to take place, because we can't really have these sort of evidential reasoned way of understanding the religious experience. And that's how he kind of squares away belief and logic and sort of these different arguments that are made within his history and views of the natural order. And so I think you can also perhaps look at him as a sort of father of utilitarianism as we'll go on. These sense impressions, as they were to Hume, is these copies of ideas. They can be imaginations, but they're reflections ultimately through the mental state about recursive impressions historically within custom of resemblance. And I think maybe it's perhaps another footnote to look at how Hume, despite the school of thought he's coming from in the Enlightenment period, I don't think he would support disrupting resemblance between people. He would obviously perhaps find a sort of pre-utilitarian notion of why you wouldn't want to do that to a society. But so that's really how he gets to morality. It's these sort of impressions upon our experience out of moral sentiments and these memories of these impressions. And there's a distinction that he draws between passions of violence and love and provoking passions that can even go towards a sort of involuntary way, as opposed to the calm and the aesthetic and satisfaction and the beauty and harmony that comes out of the lack of order, if you will, towards evil in a way. And so that's really how he kind of sees it epistemologically towards moral knowledge and reason, and trying to form the relationship out of it. You certainly see that moral knowledge within reason is, ideas, as Locke would say, about property and theft. We have these sort of demonstrative moral imperatives and relationships of these ideas. And so if you have a right to property, then you don't have the right to steal someone else's property. But of course, Hume obviously doesn't look at moral knowledge in that sort of way. His critique of the natural law ethics is obviously that it's a sort of subjective way, and how can you have a state of nature that is constructed out of society first and then given to us? Property, to Hume at least, is the product of an organized society. So how can it be transcendent and before us if organized society gave us the perception of what property is how Hume critiqued Locke there. And so I think perhaps it's also important to look at how other people saw Hume and the sort of subjectiveness that he's going about towards taste and feelings of sentiment. He's trying to draw a distinction between reason and these sentiments, but he's really perhaps divorcing them and creating a sort of subjective experience as sort of a shared one within reason. And so reason to Hume is the definitions of what these moral customs are. So justice is what is the definition of it? That is the morality of reason. And so he harkens back to utility as the linkage between reason and sentiment. And how is he going to do that? Is because reason, the empirical law way of looking at morality, it doesn't actually motivate, it doesn't actually give you passion, it doesn't actually give you love, it doesn't actually emote. It just simply describes the consequences, and those consequences are formed out of our moral sentiments, the feelings of benevolence that each person is given to us through our nature, as he would put it, through our psychology. And so, wishing and wanting out of benevolence for other people is how he fulfills that sort of natural altruism. And obviously it's in variance of difference between how much you can wish upon someone through pleasure and pain for other people. And so reason can inform you of similarities between experience out of resemblance, is how Hume constructs that argument for us. He's giving us an ethical nature out of moral psychology instead of relying on metaphysical reasoning, as it were, to him. Laws of nature are these sort of artifacts that come to us. It's kind of some would argue, of course, that this is kind of semantical, of course, that you have these artifacts that come about to us. Of course, he says that they are given to us by God, but of course, in his famous skepticism, we don't know how genuine that actually is. And so that's how he really gets to his idea of the ethical nature. This sort of psychology is given to us out of experience, and we are able to subjectivize these feelings into reason, and to give each man his due diligence, because we can refer to these sentiments obviously within the bounds of, equilibrium, of taking in the tandem of emotion and forming reason out of it. And I think that's how he gets towards, law and its utilitarian sake of why it's important to have a just law. As he looked at other provinces, as he looked at other civilizations in his time, he saw the rule of law in each of them. And so obviously the rule of law is the best way to give everyone the due diligence out of their experience. And so yeah, this is just kind of a summation of Hume's ethics and thoughts on religion and belief, and how he compartmentalized all of these different features of the human psychology. But I hope you guys enjoyed watching this, and I'll see you guys for the next one. I think we're going to start Kant next. If not, maybe a small video on the realist school and some of the critiques towards Hume that comes out we could do as well. But yeah, thanks for watching.